shale gas in Washington, D.C., and we are very pleased to have him here this evening. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Muehlenbachs.
I have to thank the organizers for inviting us and having other people here that are going to complement what I'm talking about. As a matter of fact, Dr. Leckie covered, and it's covered a lot of the same topics I'm going to talk about, including the same slides and so on. And I'll try to present it from a slightly different point of view. And now, the shale gas stuff is a hot issue. I mean, essentially, it's here, it's happened, it's had a tremendous impact on the world. We already heard about the specific economic indicators. This happens to be something I just saw. It's a magazine out of Britain that's basically for amateur capitalists. What do you do with your money? And the cover basically tells you that shale gas is going to affect the whole economy of the world. But shale gas is a hot topic. There's all sorts of reports coming out. And this is a report that just came out about a month ago from the Government Accountability Office in the United States Senate. And it's essentially the agency of the U.S. government that's supposed to give unbiased advice to the Congress and the Senate, and the Congress and the Senate. And essentially, as you can see the title, it says it's called Shale Gas and Oil Development. And I'm going to draw your attention to the fact that it adds at the end public health risks, and this will come up a little bit later. And so it's a long report. It's available on the internet, and it lists. It's based on the U.S. This is the U.S. Congress thing. It basically estimates reserves and et cetera, et cetera. But it does make a general statement that's saying that shale gas, there are risks involved in conventional production as well as in shale gas, but the risks are unknown at this stage. And the risks are going to be dependent on the location because the geology is different in different reservoirs and so on and so forth. Again, it's something accessible on the web, but I would recommend you to look it up. And now, so we know that there has been a revolution, a financial explosion, let's say, of shale gas, but we know there's risks involved. And what are they, or how are we assessing it? And so the background of my talk is that the part of it has been such a rapid development, and simply because the development's been so rapid, the regulators and so on are playing catch up. In other words, the rules are being made after the horse left the barn. So a lot of the problems that you hear about in Pennsylvania, Dimmock, and so on, is basically because when they started doing shale gas at the very beginning, around 205, 204, 206, basically they weren't following rules. And now they have rules, but the problem persists. Part of the other problem is that there's really a lack of data. Because everything is so new, there's actually not that much hard data, hard information available on various aspects of the shale gas revolution. And then, even then, the stuff that has been published, because there's been so few studies, each study has received a lot of attention, a lot of scrutiny, and has generated usually a counter-argument. There's a lot of disagreements. And the other thing is that the views are changing rapidly. So, for instance, I pointed out the public health thing. At least from my perspective of watching the news and so on, the idea that shale gas applies to somehow can affect public health, that's a new concern. That wasn't in the press a year ago. On the other hand, I'm going to talk, as Dr. Leckie did, about earthquakes. Earthquakes were in the news a lot last year, but I predict next year they're just going to be off the radar screen. No one's going to be talking about them anymore. big exception. I mean, for instance, next week, Dr. Leckie and I are going to a technicals meeting in Banff called the GoosUpCon. It's put on by the Canadian Society of Petroleum Geologists, and it will be basically experts talking about good old times and having fun and understanding shale gas. At the same time, there's a big convention in Charlotte called the Geological Society of America meeting, which is simultaneously going on, where many, many American hydrogeologists especially are going to be talking about shale gas, but to other hydrogeologists, I mean, other true believers. So this tonight is probably, you know, a very rare occurrence where actually you have a spectrum of people in the same room talking about the same problem, because it's usually people just talking to their friends, cliques, like in high school cliques and so on. And so the net result is that in terms of the public, there's heated debate and controversy about this topic. And we already saw this. Dr. Leckie referred to the same study that came out early this year in Canada, saying that most Canadians oppose natural gas fracking. And the question is basically why. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run down, like the Dave Letterman show, I'm going to run down some reasons why Canadians might oppose shale fracking. Now I want to point out to you that it's not the East against the West, or it's basically Canada-wide statistics. And number 10, the big reason, the big elephant, which Dr. Leckie addressed quite eloquently, is basically the makeup of the frac chemicals. And there's no reason to hide behind it. It's called the Halliburton Amendment. In the early stages of the Bush administration, they passed an exception to the drinking water, the Clean Drinking Water Act in the United States Congress, saying oil companies did not have to disclose the identity of chemicals they're using in fracking. And this basically immediately raised questions, what does Cheney and Halliburton trying to do to me? And essentially, then companies would say, yeah, I don't have to tell you. And so there was when the Democrats still controlled the Congress, they basically convened a committee to try to find out what the chemicals were. The Republicans wanted they took over the House, but the minority group still produced this report on behalf of the U.S. Congress. And what we can see here is that a large variety of chemicals were being used, and many of them are totally innocuous, totally innocent, but there were 29 known carcinogens that were being used as in various concentrations, but those 29 carcinogens were incorporated into some 600 odd different concoctions. And so, needless to say that this has aroused, very, negative reaction, and of course, in response to the public, the agencies are saying it's mandated. Now, Alberta is really behind the times. I said again, the industry, the explosion is way ahead. The regulators are trying to catch up. So even though BC says it has the frac thing on the web, Alberta, as I understand it, says, oh, maybe next year, So what are we to do? And it's not an idle, just twiddle your thumbs idle question, because let's all remember what happened at Innisfail in earlier this year. And essentially what we see here on the snow is our frac fluids. And the question is, what's in them? I mean, there's guys standing in it. Is it the 29 carcinogens? You can see out here a little staining on the snow, because when it was spraying out and when the blowout occurred, the wind was blowing, and so the stuff was spread around quite far. So the question is, that I have is, will the landowners and will those workers be ever told what this gunk was that came out? Now, where did it come from? And this is what's called well communication. And essentially, what you see here is stones. It is stolen from the Scientific American in November last year, and it was an article that tried to discuss, the pros and cons of fracking, groundwater pollution, and so on. And I'm just using their graphing. And what happened in Innisfail, to the best of my knowledge, is there was fracking going on people like here, people are injecting fluids under high pressure, and the fluid's going where they should, and this is a blow-up. It's just a blow-up, and this is a blow-up of that. The fluid's going along, but somehow it intersected another well. In the diagram from Scientific American, it's called an abandoned well. Now, Alberta is riddled with abandoned wells, but this happened in Innisfail. This happened to be an active well. It was drilled in 1983, pumped away happily as could be, and then it got interrupted. It got the rude awakening of having all this injection fluid intersect the well and then shoot out to the top. So that's another worry about it. Now, this is a diagram that we already saw of the draft report from the EPA, and I have a different take on the report. And essentially, it says that whatever can go done, however you do oil well drilling, you did it wrong in this case, including the fact that the fracks were actually quite shallow. The surface casings were really shallower yet. I'm going to show these in another slide. And the well cements were all corroded. They ran tests for the quality of the cement, the casings that we just saw from the last lecture. A lot of those that failed were all corroded to hell. And the test wells that the EPA drilled intersected stuff that essentially lied. Certainly not anything natural. Now remember, when you're talking about what I said about the secrecy of this, so the operator had no legal obligation to tell, I misspoke, the operator had no legal reason to tell the EPA what was in the mixture that they were using for frac fluid. So the EPA had to guess what to test for. Because they wouldn't, if you knew that they were injecting potassium chloride, you could test for potassium chloride. But if you're just told, I'm not going to tell you, then you have to test for everything, which is almost impossible, and you can imagine the problem. Now, as far as the depths of fracking and how far, like this wellbore communication, how far apart are wells safe to be before one can impact the other one? There's been a lot of work on that, and this is a study that just came out a little while ago. It's still in, I think it's in print now in Marine Technology, but it argues that on a survey of existing data, that the longest fracture that occurred from vertical fracture that occurred by fracking was about 580 meters in the U.S. But there's natural fractures available too. And those are longer, they're about 1,000 years. But there's a distribution, and again, I'll show it later, I think, by time. So you can statistically ask, like, how long are these fractures on average? And as Dr. Lecky showed on his slides from the various basins, they're actually not 600 meters each. They're probably, 50 meters, 100 meters, and so on. But you can ask statistically, what's a safe offset from this kind of information? And then we're back to Pavilion, and this is in that EPA report. This top diagram basically tells you the depths of the perforations in this field. There's about 160 wells. Some were fracked quite shallow, some were fracked quite deep. This is the depth of the surface casings, and they're all quite shallow. And this is the depth to the water table, and the water wells can be quite deep. So in other words, only two of all the wells in the Pavilion are protected by surface casings. Plus, the cementing, I said, was rotten anyway. So in Alberta, this would be considered completely illegal. But in Wyoming, you can do what you want. Now, as an aside, it's got nothing to do, but I realize the interest of this audience, so I'm going to make an aside. That in Alberta, this business about shallow or deep and so on, most of what Dr. Lecky talked about, I agree with, because he's talking about the deep fractures, and the deep wells. But in this particular neighborhood we're in, we know for a fact that there's been lots and lots of thousands of wells that have been fracked shallow for coal bed methane. And they're not hydraulic fractures and so on, but they're still fractures. And here, the rules, the Alberta rules are pretty liberal for, that you can basically frack 50 meters underneath a water well that's 200 meters away. And remember, that's happened thousands of times. Another issue that's on point number 6 that we have to worry about in the countdown is that just because you see a fracture instantly responding to the injection of the fluid, it doesn't mean that the net result is ended or that there's a time delay. And so this particular scientific study tries to estimate from modeling, this is all computer modeling, how long, once you frack a deep well, how long will, can effects show, or how much later will effects show up? And essentially what this paper says is, if water wells are to be, if there is going to be surface contamination of deep processes, it probably will only show up 6 years or 10 years later. So even if something is done wrong, you won't see the problem for another 6 or 10 years. So you've got to keep that in mind too, that, just because you didn't see a problem today, the day after they frack, the problems might show up 10 years later. Okay, now the issue of water, in some ways, in some jurisdiction, this is really the gorilla in the room. Because to do fracking, there's different kinds of fracking. There's different, what's called slick water fracking. That's when you need giant amounts of water, tens of thousands of liters. And where do you get this water? And again, that's going to depend on the jurisdiction. If you have lots of, like in British Columbia now, they're taking water from behind the Dawson Dam. Shell Oil is actually processing sewage water from Dawson Creek and for injection. In Alberta, where there's been some fracking, that's my understanding is that some of the operators are buying water from municipalities because there is no, there's nothing available. So in a drought area, a dry area, this can become a problem. In a wet area, it's not an issue at all. By the same token, we're getting rid of the waste that comes back. It's called flowback water. In Alberta, we're blessed with a huge infrastructure of waste disposal wells, so it's simply not an issue. But like in New Brunswick, there's been some development in New Brunswick, but they have to take the wastewater all the way to Nova Scotia to be disposed of. So the waste disposal is a serious issue. And again, it depends on the jurisdiction. At the beginning, in Pennsylvania, they were actually taking the wastewater to municipal sewers, just dumping it in the sewers. And that actually caused all sorts of problems, and that triggered the New York Times to start a series of anti-fracking articles. So again, the industry really shot itself in the foot on that one, because essentially the newspaper said, the drinking water of Pittsburgh is being contaminated with radioactive waste from the backflow that was being just dumped into the sewers. Now, in theory, that's been banned. In theory, that doesn't happen in Pennsylvania, but through loopholes and so on, it still is happening in Pennsylvania. But again, it's a jurisdictional issue. It's not a universal issue. Okay, now the earthquakes we heard about. And again, because the people are tense and nervous about fracking, earthquakes take place, you wind up blaming them, blame somebody. And there was the anti-fracking movement would basically blame the earthquakes on fracking, and it's a complete misnomer. The earthquakes that occurred in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, are associated with waste injection. And as Dr. Lecky said, this is a very well-known phenomenon. It's associated mostly with Denver, Colorado, actually, because it's that leftovers from the Cold War. The military was doing it, started causing earthquakes, and it caused all sorts of scientific advances, actually. But what do you do about it? Well, the mayor of Youngstown knew what to do. he went and bought earthquake insurance. Now, this was referred to by Dr. Leckie too, is that this is a fantastic report that I would urge you to download from the internet. It's got all sorts of neat things in it. It's written, don't be intimidated if you're afraid of technical literature. It's readable. And essentially what they notice is that, yes, it's too sensitive. I don't know why. I was able to do it before, but now I'm losing my touch. Well, anyway, okay. All right, so there were earthquakes that were detected instrumentally from far away. So Dr. Leckie said that they're just like this, bang, bang. But if you can actually detect it, hundreds of miles away, then you know it's not kids' play. So these earthquakes were detected. The industry and the government did further investigate. Something is weird. They did further investigation. What they found is that in the Horn River, only the frac wells associated with faults, known and then later on discovered afterwards. And essentially what's happening is that when you saw pictures of the microseismics and so on and so forth, it's basically you're pumping energy into the rock and it breaks and it uses up the energy you put in. These earthquakes, when you pump them in water and they break, they give off more energy than you put in. And that's why they're big earthquakes with fours and so on. And so essentially that's the difference. Microseismics and so on is you basically get out what you put in. But all of a sudden, if you get out lots more than you put in, you're talking something serious. But the serious part is very understandable because they're associated with these faults. And faults are where there's breaks in the rock and there's stress. And basically what's happening is the water is releasing the stress and then you get the earthquake. So in terms of what Dr. Leckie said of doing it is as an operator in the area, Nexon simply isn't going to frack a fault. They're just not going to do it. So it's a problem that in that sense is solved, and that's why I said in the future you're going to stop hearing about the danger of earthquakes from fracking because now we understand the story. And I think we can learn from that when we talk about the other issues with fracking. Is if we do detailed studies, understand, and are public and announce it, then I think we can overcome some of the issues that we're facing, some of the divisiveness that we're facing. So, for instance, if you have heard some people talk about fracking a year ago or 2 years ago, they would, on one side, say, oh my God, there's going to be earthquakes, it's going to ruin us all. On the other side would say, no, it's impossible, it'll never happen, it just won't happen, take my word for it. Well, now we know it does happen. It's not particularly big, but we understand the mechanism. We know how to avoid the problem. Okay, now the study from the big study from Osborne and so on. Now, the importance of the study shouldn't be underestimated. It's been criticized, by myself included, for being insufficient. There's all sorts of flaws in it. But it's published in something called the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And it's published by very reputable scientists. And so it immediately, attracted attention. Because again, analogously to the earthquake situation, some of the industry spokesmen said, oh, water wells are never contaminated. It's impossible to contaminate a water well. It just doesn't happen. And all of a sudden you have evidence that we heard about, and I won't repeat, and that it might happen. So the final point that Canadians were suspicious of fracking are basically pictures like this, essentially burning water. And again, Dr. Leckie mentioned some of the cases, and this is the Josh Fox, the cinematographer who filmed it, saying, oh, this is all fake, it's all been exaggerated, and so on. But if you look at the report that Dr. Leckie referred to, and you can see that actually there is a case number 3, and case number 3 is, whoops. Case number 3 basically says, we conclude that A.B. Ellsworth's well contained a mixture of biogenic and photogenic methane that was in part attributable to oil and gas development. Now, so in a way it contradicts the statement that there's no proven evidence that there was one, because this is actually written by the Colorado Commission. But then they add a comment saying, Mrs. Ellsworth and an operator reached a settlement in that case. So by definition, then they exclude it. And I think when we look at our own stories of Alberta, and probably any other jurisdiction in North America, is there must be, I don't know, dozens, hundreds, thousands of cases that have been settled out of court. And so, you know, on paper it looks as if nothing ever happened, but we all know that in the back room there's been a deal made to cover it up. Anyway, there definitely are man-made gas seeps. So here we have a picture of a wellhead. It's a well cellar, it's beneath the Earth's surface, so basically it's filled up with water, and you see all sorts of bubbles coming out of it. The bubbles aren't coming from a leaking flange, they're coming from along the wellbore, you know, because of casing failure and so on and so forth. Closer to home, oops, that was from Dimmock, Pennsylvania. Closer to home in Turner Valley, we've had basically natural, well, they're not natural, but they're fires, perpetual fires around the Turner Valley, where basically old gas wells and oil wells are leaking. This one was actually finally plugged in 2010 using some isotope techniques I'm going to talk about in a little minute. And there are natural seeps, and again, this one here is in Turkey. It's a site of an ancient Greek temple. This used to be part of the temple where the priestesses would pray to the eternal flame and maybe sniff some of the fumes and get some insights and make predictions. But anyway, this has been burning for well over 2,000 years, and it's completely natural. There's no doubt about it. Also, in northwest Alberta, we have this thing called the hot pots. Again, this is very deep gas. This is a student of ours from University of Alberta who collected gas samples, analyzed them. These are very deep gases that are coming to the surface because of faults in the foothills area. And so they definitely are natural seeps. As a matter of fact, the exploration, the first technique of gas and oil exploration was basically looking for natural seeps, and then you drill where the natural seep is. So there's definitely natural seeps, and there are man-made seeps. Well, anyway, we'll go back to that later. But so essentially, what you might say that Dr. Leckie and I agree on almost everything, and this is no surprise actually, because there's a research foundation in Washington D.C. called Resources for the Future, who actually conducted a survey of experts, and I was actually involved in designing it. And essentially, they asked experts in shale gas development. I mean, even working for industry, government, NGOs, and academia. They said, well, what kind of risks are routine, like the everyday problems you have? And because this is a computer-graded thing, we gave them choices. So there's 264 potential risks, and then you had to say which of those risks should have more attention, less attention, and so on. And then the other question is that there's accidents, there's catastrophes. What are the catastrophes that you anticipate with shale gas development? And we provided 14 accidents, and then for the accidents, you had to say how likely they are to take place and how much damage is going to result from it. Now, the surprising thing is that out of those 264 possibilities, the various experts agreed on practically all, the 3 most important or the 12 most important ones. And so it turns out that if you isolate from the statistics, and this stuff is unpublished, it's going to come out pretty soon. If you isolate, what do you think is the problem or routine risk? 7 of them concern surface water, 2 concern groundwater, 1 concerns habitat disruption. But all, every those are the big issues. And then if you isolate what the industry people said was important, is actually said community impacts. And that's perhaps why you have representatives from Quicksilver and Nexen here tonight, because they realize that community impact matters. Okay, now for the accidents, it's interesting again that they had 14 choices, but practically everyone picked only 2, and it was cement failure and casing failure, which is exactly what Dr. Leckie is talking about. And the government people, NGOs, academia tend to say, well, for number 3 is impoundment failure. Again, this is site-specific, and in the Horn River, they do have big impoundments. Here we don't, but they're basically, they're an artificial pond, and then if it's really poisonous stuff, you say it's kind of dangerous, don't you think, to have this pond sitting there? So that's what they're thinking. And then the interesting thing is that the industry, if you isolate what the industry people think is the danger, the biggest danger is truck accidents. And I've heard this separately, is that, yeah, they're driving, and somebody might work for the industry and so on, is, those guys that pick up trucks, and the big trucks, you gotta be a little careful. All right, so getting back to the wellbore stuff, here's the statement. I could have picked up many different kinds of statements, and this is from someone from the Unconventional Resources Department that basically says, if you do it right, oil wells won't leak, gas wells won't leak, whether you frack them or don't frack them, everything will be fine if you did it right. So my question is, what happens if you don't do it right? Well, if you don't do it right, they leak. And this is a diagram I stole from the UV and Bachu and Watson. And essentially, again, these are the casings we talked about. And if the cementing or whatever isn't right, you will have gas escape. In other words, Mother Nature doesn't just provide gas at the pay zone. There's gas probably all along the wellbore. And essentially, you can have leaks coming up from the pay zone, but you can have leaks originating much shallower depth. And this is going to be a key point to what I'm going to finish with. Now, the next question is, how frequently do you see these problems? And this is an interesting study. It's done by, it's a survey of offshore wells in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, you might say, what's that? What's the relevance of that to the fracking for shale gas? Well, the relevance is it's just the technology of finishing wells, and this is in federal territory. So these are wells that are actually inspected. This isn't self-reported by the industry. This is actually a federal inspector looking and testing what's leaking. And lo and behold, what they find is that about 5 to 10% of the brand new wells have surface casing problems to start with. And then as they age, they get worse and worse. And so by 16 or 20 years, essentially 60% of them have problems. So that's, you're talking serious stuff. Now, I guess I'm getting punched from here, but I was talking about this previous slide. I realize now that it wasn't on. So this is the offshore stuff. I think it's analogous to the onshore stuff, is that at the beginning, 5% leak. I just saw some web stuff this afternoon that claims in the Pennsylvania, Marcellus shales and so on, that they have the same issue. About 6 or 7% of the wells leak. This is crazy, I'm really going to that. Now in Alberta, this is again from the Bachu study, that about 5 to 10% of the wells leak. Some of them have ground migration, gas migration around them. But again, it's a significant issue. They studied a small area near here. If we went to Lloydminster, we find that 50% of the wells have surface casing vent flow problems. In Spirit River, I know an area, there's 100% of the wells have a problem. So these are serious issues. And if they're serious, as Dr. Leckie said, we want to fix them. So how do we fix them? Well, to fix them, you have to know where the gas originates. And how do we know where the gas originates? Well, we do it by that's why I'm here, I'm bragging about my own work. We do it by isotopes. Some of you might not know what isotopes are. Some of you came to my short course I gave a few years ago on isotopes and water wells and so on. I'm not going to tell you about it. You'll just have to take my word for it or sign up for another short course. But anyway, the isotope ratio, the carbon-13 to carbon-12 and methane, depends on how it was formed. And essentially, if you ask about how methane is formed, it's either formed shallow, as we heard, like biogenic gas. We can have coal bed gases. I mean, the shallow CBN, the gas, the coal around this part of the world is usually quite shallow. It's being exploited. So it's not very, very deep. So the isotope ratio of the gas is not that different from biogenic gas, but slightly different. But as you go deeper, you progressively get more and more positive values or less negative values, and then when you hit the shales, they go screwy. They're totally different. We're going to talk about that briefly. So how do you use this information to identify the source of leaks? Well, you do this the easiest way, the best way, and this is done in the Lloyd area, is you basically collect gas while you're drilling a new well. And then you know how far down you are when you collected the gas, and you have what we call isotope stratigraphy. So we know the isotope ratios change with depth. Okay, and then methane isn't all that useful for this purpose, so we look at the other components, like ethane, propane, and butane, like propane in your lighter, butane or propane in your barbecue, butane in your lighter. They all exist in natural gas. And so those isotope ratios change. Now you can see that there's a kink in the line, and that's basically where the geology changes. So deeper down we have the mantle. The reason there's a big difference is in the mantle, that's where the heavy oil is, and that's where bacteria have been chewing on it, so the bacteria have affected the gas that used to be there, whereas above is basically gas that is generated in place as the material is buried. Okay, so then we go to the oil field and look at these surface casing vent flows or water well in the neighborhood, and we collect the gas, and then we basically focus our attention on the surface casing vent flow, and then we just match. Where is the best match between the surface casing gas and the gas that our template, and the best guess is then that's where the source of the surface casing vent flow is. So we've been doing this for thousands of surface casings. We haven't done, well, we've done quite a few water wells, but you can do the same thing. Is you can take gas out of a water well, and then you basically analyze it, match it up, and see that in this case the water well has got gas in it from the mantle. The water well itself is only 100 meters deep, but it's got gas from 600 meters down. It's obviously contaminated. But anyway, if you look at these surface concentrated surface casing ones, we've done thousands of them around Alberta, and in some cases we have gas from the production tube as well as the surface casing. So if the gas from the production, if the surface casing gas or the soil gas was from the production, then they'd be identical. And then in these kinds of plots, they'd all be on a straight line. But most of them aren't. And that is because most of the leaks we actually see don't come from the production zone. They come from more shallow areas, basically because we're in a sedimentary basin. The various sediments contain various amounts of gas. Some of them take cement better, some of them corrode, the soil is more corrosive or something, and you get selective leaks. And if you do statistics, you can see then that in this field that I've been talking about near here, essentially, proportionately, most of the leaks come from one particular well. But the important thing for the overall picture that I want to address is that certainly casing integrity, casing leaks are a very, very serious issue. A confounding issue is that just because it's an oil well targeted or gas well targeted at a particular horizon, it doesn't mean that it's the gas from that horizon that is the environmental problem. And this is an important point. You can imagine a lawyer would say, wait a minute, the gas in your water well doesn't come from my company's production, so I'm not at fault. But the fact of the matter is that if the gas is coming from anywhere along the well, it could have migrated along the casing into the aquifer and then into the water well. So that's just the point that we have to take a look at. Now, excuse Excuse me. Now, the shale gas, we're not really developing shale gas in Camrose. Most of the developments are, further west at the Montney or the Horn River Basin. And this is just basically some raw data. I'm basically bragging, I'm basically advertising myself. Is that we've got isotope ratios, and again, here, this sort of goes back to that first, or the second slide, or third slide from the Congressional Government Accountability Office, is that each section is a little bit different. So there's no magic formula to solve every environmental problem for every basin. And so when we start, this is just the production gases from the Horn River and the Montney. And you can see that the Montney has a much wider spread of values. Again, I don't expect you to know what the delta C13 methane means. It's basically a measure of how much C13 these components have by comparing the methane to the ethane. And the Montney has a much wider spread, but the spread in any case is different in the Horn River. And that's because, well, there's geological stories we published on it. But the point is that these wells also leak, not just the Lloydminster well leaked. And so here we have only the Montney data for the moment. And then again, the surface casing vents have a much wider range of isotope values than the production gases. And it just reinforces what I said before, is that the environmental problem gases don't necessarily come from the target zone. And it confounds the remediation part, but we can identify where they're coming from. And then if you look at the Horn River, so the ones up here, just from the isotope values and so on, you can tell that these must be deeper gases. These little X's are the surface casing. So there are the odd surface casing vent gas that did originate in the production horizon, but many of them originated in much shallower, sometimes like even in swamp gas type environment. The Horn River is behaving very differently. I don't know whether it's biased by sample. In other words, somebody just sending me samples that are only deep from the Horn River, or the fact that the Horn River people know how to stop shallow leaks. I don't know. The point is that again, we can diagnostically test where the source of the problem gas is. And then again, this water is always an issue. I don't have any water wells from that area, but we do have well cellar gas. In other words, it's water that's at the surface, it's surface water, but it's being, penetrated by bubbles from great depths. But they can be from different depths, and not necessarily. This is the Montney, production gas. This is the Montney production. Oh, shoot, this is terrible. That's getting seasick out there. I'll give up. I'll just read off the file. There's the Montney production gases. The surface casing vent gases are different from the production. The conduct, as we saw in the diagram that Dr. Leckie showed, there's different conductors, there's different casings. There's the conductive barrel, the well cellar gas, and so on. So each one is coming from a different source. And so it makes it complicated for the remediation, but that's just a fact of life. They are. Okay, so my bias here is from the stable isotope geochemistry. My bias is on actually identifying where these fugitive gases, where these problem gases are coming from. And I showed you how it can be done. So going forward, what should we do? Dr. Leckie said that baseline testing is extremely important, and that's true. But exactly what needs to be done? And so you need the water well data. Pre-drilling water well. We should survey regions. Alberta it's a little difficult because there's been so much drilling over so many generations. Like, what is true background? Is there any true background in Alberta anymore? British Columbia, they're a little more lucky because they can actually probably find areas that are truly virgin. Now, they should also test, if you want a background, you should also test what the surface casing of the existing abandoned wells in the area is. And because that'll give you an idea of the distribution of the natural gases, the natural seeps and springs. Again, the cameras, I don't think you have any natural seeps, but elsewhere that can be a real issue. And if you're going to use this kind of information in any sense, you need production gases and this kind of mudlog I just showed you. I was involved with the baseline study for the CBM stuff a few years ago, and a weakness in that program is that, okay, the farmers provided the water, the companies tested the water wells, but there was no complementary information offered on what the coal gases actually were. And so, you know, what's the point of the whole exercise? And then what I think is important is also to look after the fraction. I mean, especially after that Innisfail slide. I mean, I'm dying of curiosity. There's other oil wells in that area that underneath the fracking area. And do the pre-existing wells, the offset wells, they didn't blow out so spectacularly. Have they actually gotten more surface casing vent flow from that? You know, in other words, we'll find injection fluid in the surface casings. Who knows? Unless we look. So I think it's very important to do like a post-fracking follow-up. Now, what I've suggested isn't particularly onerous. It's cost money, but it's not all that bad because CAP is more or less suggesting. Again, Dr. Leckie pointed out that a lot of these suggestions are found also in the capitalist. But my point is that apparently Nexon and presumably Quicksilver is committed to following CAP's guidelines. But unless it's done mandatory, I don't think it's going to convince that many people that the industry is doing a good job. I mean, you can't rely on the goodwill of a few good companies. I mean, we need strong regulation that enforces these things, not just voluntarily. Now, this CAP isn't unique. It's not the only place. It's interesting that very much the same thing shows up in something called the Golden Rules for Golden Age of Gas. And this comes out of Paris. Remember, France is one of the countries that banned shale gas development. But it's an international agency based in Paris called the International Energy Association. And you can actually download this too from the web. And it essentially does the same thing. So there's really not that much controversy about what should be done. The only question is, will it be done? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muehlenbachs. So now comes the portion of the evening where we get to have my mom's cookies. Part of the conference is to bridge divides that maybe might separate us from one time or the other. Traditional rural urban industry, environment, etc. And in conversing about this, my mom said, growing up in New Norway, which is just 20 minutes from here, there was considerable debate amongst, my mom grew up on a dairy farm, amongst the rural folks in terms of the size of the cookies. Because the New Norway rural folks made larger cookies than the city folks. So we have a happy medium this evening. I think we've got medium-sized cookies for everyone. Thanks, Mom. So we're all sitting at tables in the spirit of Albertans working together across different perspectives to develop a common vision, ethic, understanding about caring for our land. So in this part of the evening, and also continued on tomorrow, we'd like to ask you amongst your tables to discuss what you've heard and where you come from and how you responded to the information that was presented. So, theoretically, at most tables there is a facilitator. There may be a few tables where we haven't managed to put someone, but the format is as such. Firstly, we'll go around and introduce ourselves, saying your name and where you're from, and also a question that you would like to direct to one of the presenters. So your name and where you're from, and then a question for either Dr. Leckie or Dr. Muehlenbachs. And then there's a sheet at your table where you can write down the questions. So we'll go around once by way of introduction, and the facilitator will write down the questions, and we'll pick them up to be asked towards the end of the evening. So following the introduction, then if you would just share conversation. What did you hear? What struck you? What are your concerns? And in the spirit of listening, certainly we don't expect you to be an expert, but you do have a sense of your truth, and we'd like to hear. So the spirit is listening to one another, and not to spark arguments or debates, but to hear the perspectives of those you're seated with. So we'll give about 15-20 minutes for that, and then we'll ask the questions of our panelists.